Welcome to Secrets of History, where the past unveils its darkest mysteries. They say some towns die twice, once when their people are gone, and again when their stories are buried. The Shallows is one of those towns. Hidden somewhere along the misty edge of the Delaware River, it looks like any quiet American settlement: small houses, an old church, a cemetery resting beneath crooked willow trees. But if you look closer, something feels off. The air doesn't move right. The birds don't sing here. And the few who still live nearby never talk about what really happened within its borders. For years, the Shallows kept a strange secret. People died, but no one ever filed the paperwork. No records, no certificates, no trace. Just funerals held in silence, and graves that multiplied beneath the soil. Locals say the Reverend would ring the bell 3 times before midnight, his signal that another soul was being taken care of. But no one was ever seen leaving town, only buried under it. Old government archives list the Shallows as inactive, yet census reports still count its population as unchanged. Even stranger, investigators found more graves than names ever recorded. Doctors who questioned it vanished, records were burned, and the town quietly erased itself from history. But here's the thing about the Shallows: it doesn't stay hidden for long. Every few decades, someone finds their way there, drawn by the silence, the mystery, or maybe something darker calling from below. And if you ever step inside, you'll notice how the wind dies when you cross the bridge, how the air feels thick like it's waiting. Because in the Shallows, the dead were never really gone. They were simply unreported. The Shallows was never meant to be found. Tucked deep beyond the twisting roads of the Delaware Basin, the town sits quietly against the river's bend, a place so still that even the wind seems hesitant to pass through. To outsiders, it might look like any forgotten American settlement, a patchwork of leaning fences and shuttered windows, but there's something different in the air. The silence feels heavy, like it's holding its breath. The Shallows has been abandoned by maps, its coordinates erased from modern records, as if someone wanted it to vanish completely. Those who've stumbled upon it describe an eerie tranquility, a town frozen mid-sentence, waiting for something that never comes. The isolation isn't just geographical, it's spiritual. It feels like the world beyond simply moved on and the Shallows refused to follow. What you are about to hear is not just a story of a forgotten town, but a warning about the ground beneath it, a ground that some say learned to keep its own records when the living stopped keeping theirs. The landscape around it is hauntingly beautiful. The river glistens faintly in the morning mist, and the overgrown trees seem to bow toward the decaying church steeple at the heart of town. You can almost hear the echo of laughter that used to drift from the porches, the sound of wagon wheels on cobblestone, and the faint hum of hymns carried by the breeze. But those sounds are long gone. Now, the only noise is the occasional rustle of branches or the low creak of a shutter moving on its last hinge. Travelers who've accidentally driven too far down the wrong road often say it feels like stepping into another century, where time forgot to keep count. What makes the Shallows' isolation so unnerving is the feeling that it isn't just distance keeping it hidden. It's something deliberate, as if the town itself wanted to disappear. Even the nearby communities pretend it doesn't exist. Ask anyone in the next county over, and they'll lower their voice or change the subject. No one wants to talk about it, and no one can explain why. Mail carriers stopped delivering there decades ago. Utility companies stopped servicing the area without ever filing official termination reports. It's as though the Shallows quietly stepped off the grid one night and the world agreed to let it go. Those who've gone searching claim that GPS devices glitch within miles of the town line. Roads twist back on themselves. Compasses spin. The deeper you go, the more distorted the world becomes, like the landscape is rearranging itself to protect a secret. And when you finally see the faded town sign through the mist, it's almost too quiet. No birds, no insects, Just the low hum of the river and the feeling that you've crossed into a place that exists outside of life itself, where silence isn't peace, it's warning. There's something about the silence in the shallows that doesn't feel natural. It isn't the kind of quiet that comes from isolation or neglect. It's deeper, heavier, like the town itself is holding its breath. Even the wind seems to hesitate as it passes through the crooked streets, slipping around corners as though afraid to disturb whatever lingers there. The trees stand tall but motionless, their branches frozen in place, and the river that borders the town flows without a sound, its surface eerily still. To anyone who's ever stood in the middle of the shallows, the silence feels alive. It presses against the skin, settles in the chest, and fills every empty space with a quiet that whispers rather than echoes. People who've visited describe it as suffocating, as if the air itself is listening. That unsettling quiet is what makes the shallows feel haunted, even before you learn its history. In most abandoned towns, nature takes over, birds nest in the rafters, animals roam freely, and insects fill the night air with their hum. But in the shallows, life seems to avoid it altogether. No crickets, no frogs by the riverbank, no flutter of wings. The town feels sealed off, suspended between worlds. Some say it's because of the soil, that something beneath the ground poisoned more than just the earth. Others believe it's spiritual, that the quiet is a kind of barrier, keeping whatever happened there from spreading beyond the town line. Whatever the cause, it leaves you with the sense that you're being watched by something that doesn't move or breathe, but remembers. When night falls, the silence becomes even heavier. The darkness swallows the streets, and the faint outlines of the church and gravestones blur into the mist. There's no hum of electricity, no distant highway noise, just the sound of your own heartbeat and the soft crunch of gravel beneath your feet. Locals who live miles away swear they can feel it, a kind of pull, a tension in the air that starts as the sun sets. They say the silence stretches outward like invisible roots, creeping into the surrounding hills. Some nights, when the fog is thickest, the quiet reaches so far that even dogs stop barking and the river stops rippling, as though the entire valley is holding a moment of respect or fear. Standing there, surrounded by that silence, it's easy to understand why so many stories have grown around the shallows. It's a silence that hides things, secrets, maybe memories, maybe the dead themselves. It doesn't just fill the space, it owns it. It makes you wonder if the quiet is protecting the living from what still stirs beneath the ground, or if it's the other way around. But the silence is only the beginning. To truly understand the dread that surrounds this place, you must hear what happens when the locals are forced to speak, and the way their voices falter when the shallows is mentioned. When outsiders ask about the shallows, the locals change. Their expressions tighten, their eyes drift toward the floor, and their voices drop to a near whisper. It's not that they don't know the stories, it's that they've learned not to tell them. Every community nearby has its share of folklore and ghost tales, but when the shallows comes up, the tone shifts from curiosity to discomfort. People claim not to remember details or insist it's just superstition, yet their unease gives them away. Some will tell you the town used to thrive decades ago, a place with fishermen, merchants, and families who tended the riverside mills, until one day, without warning, the life just drained out of it. Others refuse to say anything at all, only shaking their heads as if words alone could summon something best left sleeping. The reluctance runs deep, passed down like an inheritance. Children grow up hearing warnings never to cross the river after dark, never to wander too close to the old bridge, and never under any circumstance to enter the town if they happen to find it. The older generations don't explain why, they just say it's better that way. The few who dared to break those rules came back different, distant, sometimes unable to speak about what they saw. One man reportedly drove through the outskirts looking for antiques and returned home at dawn, pale and trembling. When asked what happened, all he could say was that the ground moved. After that, he sold his truck, left town, and was never seen again. There's also a kind of collective denial among those who live near the borders. If you ask for directions, they'll tell you there's nothing beyond the old mill road, just forest and marshland. Yet maps from the early 1900s show a township clearly marked there, with a population of nearly 300. The records vanish after 1932, and so does any mention of its residents. Some say a flood washed the town away, but the river's levels never matched such an event. Others believe something happened, something that required silence. Whatever it was, the locals made a pact to erase it, to scrub the name from signs, to stop speaking it aloud. Their fear isn't just of the past, it's of being heard. When conversations brush too close to the topic, they glance around nervously, as if expecting someone to overhear. It's the kind of fear that doesn't fade over time but instead grows roots, binding one generation to the next. In the shallows, silence isn't forgetfulness. It's protection, and every person who's ever lived near its edge seems to know instinctively that some truths are dangerous to repeat. This code of silence was so effective that it created a void in history itself, a gap in the official record that is as deliberate as it is disturbing. For a town that once claimed to have over 300 residents, the Shallows left behind almost nothing in writing. No death certificates, no hospital reports, no cemetery logs, not even census records after a certain year. It's as if the town collectively decided to stop acknowledging death altogether. The few public records that do exist end abruptly around 1932, with no clear reason why. One moment, births and marriages were being documented like any other American settlement. The next, everything went silent. Historians who've studied the area say it's one of the strangest archival gaps they've ever seen, an entire community that seemed to vanish from paperwork but not from the earth itself. The buildings still stood, the graves multiplied, yet no official record of loss was ever written. It's as though death itself became a private matter, one the town refused to share with the world. Government inquiries were made several times in the decades that followed, especially when postal routes and property records stopped updating. Inspectors sent to investigate came back with vague, inconsistent reports. One claimed the population was smaller but stable, another said the town appeared uninhabited but maintained. None mentioned death or burial activity, even though later excavations revealed graves dating back to those missing years. The absence of documentation wasn't accidental, it was systematic. Death records are usually handled at a county level, meaning someone outside the town would have had to notice the missing data, yet no one ever did. The files weren't just lost, they were erased with purpose. The strangest part is how clean the erasure was. In the state archives, where other towns have drawers filled with certificates and licenses, the Shallows has a single envelope, yellowed, brittle, containing only a handwritten list of family names and a note that reads records deferred. Deferred to where? No one knows. Some archivists believe the town operated under its own local registry, possibly under church control, which would explain why nothing was filed through official channels. But if that's true, then those documents should have surfaced somewhere in a parish basement, a regional archive, or private estate collections. None ever did. The result is a void, one that feels intentional. Without official death records, it's impossible to prove how many people truly lived or died in the Shallows. It created a kind of bureaucratic invisibility, where generations could disappear without a trace, their existence remembered only by the graves beneath the soil. In most places, the dead are counted, recorded, and mourned. But in the Shallows, the dead simply became part of the silence, folded neatly into a history that refused to be written. And where were all these unrecorded dead laid to rest? The answer lies in a patch of land that defies all explanation, a place where the earth itself seems restless. Whispers of an old burial ground have followed the Shallows for generations, a place said to sit beneath a constant layer of fog that never fully lifts. Locals who still live near the area say the ground there breathes differently, that even the soil feels unsettled, too soft in some places, like something underneath is shifting. The supposed burial ground isn't marked by gates or gravestones anymore. Time and neglect have swallowed its boundaries. But those who know the land claim they can still trace its edges by the way the grass grows taller, denser, and darker than the fields around it. Some believe the fog itself comes from the ground, a kind of exhale from whatever is buried below. Travelers who have stumbled across it say the mist seems thicker there, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and iron, as if the land remembers what lies within. The oldest stories claim the burial ground was established long before the Shallows became a town. Settlers arriving in the early 1800s reportedly found mounds already formed, unmarked but clearly deliberate, and instead of disturbing them, they built around them. As the community grew, the burial ground became part of the landscape, half forgotten yet always near. Some accounts mention a wooden chapel that once stood beside it, where services were held for the dead. Others insist there was no chapel at all, only a series of midnight ceremonies led by a reverend whose name never appeared in any official church registry. Whatever truth lies in those details, one thing remained constant: the townspeople buried their own and spoke little about it afterward. When researchers later examined aerial photographs of the region, they noticed irregular depressions in the terrain near the riverbank, large enough to suggest mass burials. These findings were quietly dismissed by local officials as natural erosion, though no geological survey supported that explanation. Those who've dared to dig found evidence of multiple generations buried in close proximity, sometimes layered, sometimes intertwined. No markers, no names, only fragments of wooden coffins and remnants of cloth. Each discovery seemed to confirm what locals had always implied, that the burial ground was not just old, but overcrowded. At night, the fog thickens so much that even light struggles to cut through. People who have wandered close say they hear faint sounds, shuffling, whispering, the rustle of leaves with no wind. It's as if the ground itself is restless, unable to stay still. The burial ground of the Shallows has become more legend than location, a ghostly scar on the landscape that refuses to fade, where the earth seems to mourn for those the world never knew existed. The true scale of this secret was only revealed when someone finally thought to count, and discovered that the number of graves told a very different story from the number of names. When investigators first began to look into the Shallows, one of the most disturbing discoveries came from the old cemetery on the hill. At first glance, it appeared ordinary rows of weathered stones leaning at odd angles, half swallowed by ivy and time. But as records were compared and graves were counted, something didn't add up. There were far more burial sites than there were names in the surviving town registers. Dozens of unmarked mounds stretched beyond the cemetery's formal boundary, some piled close together, others forming strange, uneven rows that seemed to have been dug in haste. When surveyors attempted to match these graves to the few death certificates that existed, the numbers were impossible. For every person officially listed as dead in the Shallows, there were 3 or 4 buried bodies unaccounted for. The discovery sent quiet shockwaves through those who examined it. At first, they assumed mismanagement or lost paperwork, but the deeper they dug, both literally and historically, the more deliberate it began to look. Coffins were found stacked, not side by side, as if space had run out long before the burials stopped. Some graves contained more than one set of remains, sometimes from people of very different ages. Anthropologists called in to assist noted that many of the bodies showed no signs of embalming, no identification tags, and in some cases, no clothing at all. These weren't the burials of a well-documented, law-abiding town. They were hurried, secretive, and systematic. What puzzled experts most was how none of this was ever recorded. Every county in the surrounding area maintained accurate records for the same period except the Shallows. It was as if the town existed in a blind spot where accountability never reached. Even stranger, the cemetery itself appeared to grow larger over time, expanding into nearby fields without anyone officially registering the land as consecrated ground. Locals who lived nearby said that new graves would appear overnight, sometimes with fresh soil but no funerals, no carriages, no mourners. Just the sound of the church bell at midnight, ringing slowly 3 times, and by dawn, another mound had joined the rest. Some investigators believed disease might have wiped out parts of the population, prompting mass burials to contain an epidemic. But no medical reports supported that theory. Others whispered about darker possibilities, that the town had been burying people who were never meant to exist on paper, or perhaps trying to hide something far worse. Whatever the reason, the mismatched graves turned the Shallows from a curiosity into a warning. It wasn't just a forgotten town with an empty history, it was a place where the dead outnumbered the living, and no one ever bothered to count. To understand how such a thing could happen, we must go back to the very beginning, to the outcasts and refugees who first settled this land and built a community on secrecy. The origins of the Shallows trace back to the early 1800s, when it was little more than a patch of wetland carved between the river and the forest. According to scattered historical accounts, it began as a settlement for those who didn't quite belong anywhere else, people escaping debt, scandal, or persecution. It attracted drifters, refugees, and outcasts from neighboring states who wanted to live quietly beyond the reach of law and judgment. No one kept strict records of who arrived or who left. Land was traded by handshake, homes were built by collective effort, and what started as a handful of shacks soon grew into a modest town hidden by mist and geography. Its early years were marked by secrecy and self-reliance, values that would later become part of its darker reputation. The town's founders built their community on the belief that isolation was safety. They distrusted outsiders and avoided government oversight, handling all matters internally: births, disputes, punishments, and deaths. A small wooden church was erected at the center, doubling as both chapel and meeting hall, led by a preacher known only as Reverend Halloway. He was said to be charismatic but severe, the kind of man who spoke about redemption through silence and purity through suffering. The settlers followed him with near-blind devotion, believing the Shallows to be a refuge from a corrupt world. Over time, the Reverend's influence grew, and his word became law. Those who disobeyed were not exiled but simply vanished, their names never spoken again. The isolation that once protected the town eventually twisted into something else. Without communication or regulation from the outside, truth became flexible, shaped by whoever held authority. The church's records became the only written documents in town, and those who could read were few. The settlement prospered briefly, farms thrived, trade flowed through the river, but every story from that period ends the same way, with silence. Sometime around the mid-19th century, neighboring communities noticed fewer travelers coming and going from the Shallows. When questioned, the townspeople simply said they had all they needed and didn't want interference. By the time formal census agents tried to record the population, the town's boundaries were already fading. Roads were overgrown, maps were inconsistent, and residents refused entry to anyone asking questions. The Shallows had turned inward, preserving its secrets and building walls of superstition around its history. What began as a sanctuary for the unwanted had become a self-contained world, untouched by progress and governed by its own rules. The outcasts who built the Shallows may have sought peace, but in their search for isolation, they created a place where truth could die quietly and no one beyond its borders would ever know. This legacy of secrecy would eventually fall into the hands of one family, whose obsession with the town would bind their name to its curse for generations to come. When Elias Maddox inherited the land surrounding the Shallows, he saw potential where others saw decay. The settlement had become little more than a ghost town by the late 1800s, its population dwindled, its homes sagging under moss and rain. Most people who passed through said the place carried a heaviness, as if the air itself remembered pain. But Elias, a businessman with an eye for opportunity, believed he could breathe life back into it. He purchased several parcels of land under different names, concealing his growing ownership until nearly the entire region fell under the Maddox estate. Locals were suspicious of his motives, whispering that he didn't just want the land, he wanted the power that came with controlling its forgotten past. Elias was unlike the early settlers. He was educated, ambitious, and fascinated by history, though not in a sentimental way. He often told his family that places like the Shallows didn't die naturally, they were buried alive by the people who wanted their stories forgotten. He hired surveyors to map the old wells, boundary stones, and foundations, discovering that some structures extended far beneath the earth. What he found wasn't just remnants of old cabins but intricate tunnels, sealed chambers, and what appeared to be ritual markings carved into the walls. Elias was said to have kept detailed journals, sketching the symbols and writing down fragments of inscriptions in languages no one recognized. At first, he shared his discoveries with local historians, hoping to validate the importance of the Shallows. But when they dismissed his findings as folklore, Elias withdrew completely. He fenced off the property, dismissed the workers, and began spending long nights in the old church at the center of the abandoned town. Witnesses claimed they saw lights flickering through its windows at impossible hours, and the sound of chanting carried across the fields. Some said he became obsessed with uncovering what the settlers had been hiding, others believed he wanted to finish what they started. By the time his family noticed the change in him, it was too late. Elias's health declined rapidly in his final years. His journals became erratic, filled with phrases about preserving the bloodline and keeping the promise made beneath the water. When he died, the family sealed his study and forbade anyone from entering the Shallows after dark. Yet every generation of Maddox heirs seemed drawn back to the place, as though something in the soil called to them. Elias's restoration dream had turned into a curse, one that tied his lineage to the land's oldest and most disturbing secret, ensuring that the Shallows would never truly rest. Under the Maddox family's control, the simple act of burial transformed into something far more sinister, a systematic concealment that would earn the family a chilling nickname. When the Shallows Cemetery was first established, it was meant to be a place of quiet remembrance, a simple burial ground for the settlers who had built their lives on that land. But by the turn of the century, its purpose had twisted into something far more sinister. Families who lost loved ones began to notice inconsistencies, graves that appeared freshly dug but bore no names, funeral records that never reached the town registry, and death certificates that mysteriously vanished from county archives. The Maddox family, who by then oversaw all burials in the Shallows, dismissed the suspicions as clerical errors. Yet whispers began to spread that the family wasn't merely burying the dead, they were concealing them. The Shallows became known as the place where people disappeared quietly. Workers, drifters, and even families seeking refuge from nearby towns would arrive, only for their presence to fade from all official traces. Neighbors remembered seeing them one day and then never again, no wagons leaving, no farewells given. The Maddox patriarch at the time, Samuel Maddox, maintained meticulous control over who entered and who left, ensuring no one outside the estate ever learned how many graves dotted the property. The townspeople began calling the family the keepers of the earth, though the phrase carried an undertone of fear rather than respect. Late-night visitors sometimes saw lanterns flickering across the fields, long after the supposed burial hours had ended. They claimed to hear muffled voices, shovels striking earth, and low chanting, always the same rhythmic sound that grew louder before abruptly stopping. When locals gathered enough courage to question the family, Samuel's men turned them away with threats or bribes. The official cemetery ledgers showed fewer than 50 burials, but those who worked the grounds knew that number was a lie. There were rows upon rows of unmarked mounds, some so old that even the soil seemed to resist being disturbed again. Over time, it became clear that not all those buried in the Shallows had died naturally. Some bodies were found decades later during land disputes, bones stacked unnaturally deep, coffins overlapping, multiple remains crammed into single plots. No one could explain the absence of records or the eerie consistency with which the Maddox family denied knowing anything. But local superstition claimed that the family had made a pact generations ago, one that required them to feed the ground to preserve their fortune and lineage. Whether it was greed, madness, or something older driving them, the result was the same: a graveyard that held more questions than names, and a legacy built upon silence. As the 20th century dawned, the strange occurrences in the shallows escalated from rumor to undeniable phenomenon, as if the land itself was reacting to the secrets it held. By the 1920s, the shallows had become a place most locals avoided altogether. The once prosperous town was now a husk, its remaining residents living under the unspoken rule that no one should question the Maddox family. Rumors of the unreported burials had long since turned into folklore, but what truly unsettled the surrounding towns was the sudden emergence of strange phenomena tied to the land itself. People claimed the ground in certain parts of the property never froze in winter, no matter how bitter the cold. Animals refused to graze near the northern fields, and anyone who tried to plant crops there reported that nothing ever grew, not even weeds. The air smelled faintly of iron after every rainstorm, and faint lights were said to hover above the soil at night. The few outsiders who came to investigate, mostly journalists or historians, didn't stay long. One reporter from Boston wrote that he felt a deep humming beneath the ground while standing near the Maddox mausoleum, as though the earth was alive and restless. He left the next morning without explanation and never published his findings. Others tried to dig into the town's burial records but found them incomplete, with entire pages torn from official books or replaced with blank parchment. It was as if someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase any trace of the dead. Yet even without proof, the local community knew something unnatural lingered beneath that soil. The family themselves had grown more reclusive. The mansion's windows were shuttered year-round, and workers were hired only for short periods before disappearing without mention. Some said the Maddox descendants had inherited not only the land but also the strange obligation that came with it. Whenever one of them fell ill, the family's private grounds were disturbed again, as though another secret burial had taken place under the cover of darkness. Neighbors occasionally spotted freshly dug earth near the old chapel, yet no funerals were ever announced. Those who dared to speak of it often described hearing a low melody on the wind, like a mournful hymn sung by unseen voices. It seemed to follow anyone who walked too close to the cemetery, growing louder near the third row of unmarked graves. Old-timers began to warn that the shallows wasn't just haunted, it was hungry. The earth itself seemed to remember each unreported death and demanded to be fed again. In time, even the whispers died down, replaced by a suffocating silence that blanketed the town like fog. The shallows had crossed the line between tragedy and curse, and everyone who lived nearby learned the same lesson, that some land does not forgive being disturbed. The first real crack in the family's secretive facade appeared in the 1930s, when a man with nothing to lose decided to look too closely. When the 1930s arrived, the shallows stood as a decaying relic of its former self, its streets overtaken by vines and silence. The Maddox mansion, once a symbol of ambition and power, had become a monument of dread. Only a few family members still lived there, keeping to themselves and maintaining the same strange traditions their ancestors had guarded for decades. The towns surrounding the shallows had long accepted that something was deeply wrong with the place, but the family's influence, money, and secrecy kept any serious inquiry away. It was during this period that a young undertaker named Howard Vail stumbled upon the truth no one dared to confront. Howard had been contracted to assist with the repair of old burial vaults after heavy rains caused flooding near the cemetery. He expected decay and neglect, but what he found beneath the ground shook him to his core. Several of the tombs had been sealed with thick metal plates instead of stone, and the air around them carried an acrid scent that made it hard to breathe. When one of the vaults was accidentally cracked open, the workers uncovered not a coffin, but multiple remains, bound in fabric and marked with strange blackened symbols. Howard described the markings as burned into the flesh, as though the body had been part of some ritual. He immediately reported what he saw, but the Maddox family paid him to remain silent and replaced him with one of their own caretakers. Howard's curiosity didn't end there. Over the following weeks, he returned at night to observe from a distance, taking notes on the family's activity. He wrote of seeing processions in the graveyard long after midnight, small groups carrying lanterns and chanting in low tones, their shadows moving in perfect rhythm. Each time a light went out, another section of the earth was disturbed. When he tried to tell the sheriff, his home was ransacked, his records stolen, and he was warned to leave the county immediately. He disappeared soon after, leaving behind only a single page of his journal, which read, "They don't bury the dead to hide them. They bury them to keep them." From that moment, no one in the nearby towns doubted that the Maddox family was preserving something far darker than wealth or lineage. The legend of the Shallows evolved from whispered suspicion into a chilling certainty that beneath those fields lay not just graves, but a network of secrets so deeply rooted that even death couldn't silence them. Even as the world was consumed by global war, the isolated drama of the Shallows continued, witnessed by a government agent who had no idea what he was walking into. By the 1940s, the war had changed much of America, but the Shallows remained untouched by progress, frozen in time like an open wound that refused to heal. The Maddox estate loomed over the empty town, its paint peeling, its chimneys silent, and its great ballroom covered in dust. While most rural families were rationing supplies or sending sons off to fight, the Maddox descendants lived in isolation, keeping their strange routines alive. No one saw them in town, yet smoke rose from the manor's kitchen every morning, and candles flickered in the upstairs windows long past midnight. People began to wonder if all who lived there were truly alive. It was during this decade that a government surveyor named Charles Denton arrived in the area to map old land boundaries. He wasn't from the region and had never heard the stories. His work required him to inspect the Maddox property to verify a disputed border claim. The family refused him entry, but Charles was persistent. He walked the perimeter alone, taking notes and sketches. What he recorded later in his field journal became the most disturbing account of the Shallows since Howard Vale's disappearance. He wrote that as he crossed the eastern edge of the property, he noticed shallow depressions scattered across the field, hundreds of them, too evenly spaced to be natural. Some were caved in slightly, others freshly filled. And though the day was overcast and still, he said he heard a faint rhythm beneath his feet, like a slow-beating heart buried deep in the earth. Charles returned 2 days later with a colleague, but by then, most of the depressions had vanished, smoothed over as if someone had worked through the night to erase them. The family denied any knowledge, offering a forged document that conveniently resolved the boundary issue. Charles left the region soon after, visibly shaken. His last report to the land office mentioned ground movement inconsistent with natural soil activity and recommended that the land be declared unstable. The report was quietly archived, never followed up. Years later, a copy of his notes surfaced in a local historical society, detailing what he believed were burial pits, far more than any official record could justify. What haunted him most wasn't the sight of them, but the smell. He wrote that the air carried a metallic sweetness, like rusted blood, and that the ground itself seemed warm to the touch. Locals who read his report began to speak of the Shallows as a living thing, a cursed expanse that consumed everything buried within it. The Maddox family continued to deny all accusations, but their silence only deepened the fear that the land's hunger and their family's secret would never end. In the 1950s, as the last of the Maddox line faded from view, a new kind of phenomenon began to occur, one that suggested the house itself had developed a memory. In the early 1950s, the last remaining Maddox descendants were rarely seen outside the estate. The mansion had decayed into something unrecognizable, windows boarded, gardens overrun, the gates rusted and chained. Yet even in its ruin, the house seemed to breathe with its own kind of life. Travelers who passed through the region described seeing faint candlelight through cracks in the boarded windows, and some swore they heard the faint sound of a piano drifting through the woods at night, playing a slow, mournful tune. It was said to come from the ballroom, a room that hadn't hosted a single guest in over half a century. To the locals, it became known as the room that still waits. No one dared to go near, but the stories refused to die. It was around this time that a young mail carrier named Lillian Harper began documenting strange occurrences in the area. She was new to the route and unaware of the history surrounding the Shallows. Each week, she left letters at the estate's gate, addressed to Mrs. E. Maddox, though no one had confirmed that any such person still lived there. One foggy morning, curiosity got the better of her. She stepped through the gate to deliver a parcel directly to the door, and what she saw left her shaken. The front doors were open just slightly, enough to reveal a dimly lit hallway lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her. But it wasn't the faces that terrified her, it was the sound. Somewhere deeper inside the house, a faint melody played, echoing through the walls as though someone were performing a song to no one. Lillian fled before anyone appeared, but she returned the next week, unable to stop thinking about what she'd heard. Each time she approached the gate, she swore the same melody began again, always starting from the same note, never missing a beat. After several weeks, the letters stopped arriving, and the estate was officially listed as unoccupied. Yet, on nights when the wind was still, people said they could hear the same haunting tune coming from the hills, carried by the air like a voice calling from another time. Decades later, when local authorities finally entered the mansion after it was condemned, they found the ballroom untouched, chandeliers hanging low, dust covering every surface, and an antique piano in the corner with its lid slightly open. The keys were yellowed with age, but one was pressed down as though recently played. The discovery reignited the legend that perhaps not all who once lived in the Shallows had truly left, and that the music was not a memory, but a warning for anyone who dared to disturb the silence that the Maddox family had so carefully guarded. The 1960s saw the first organized attempt to study the Shallows, an expedition that would end not with answers, but with more questions and more missing persons. By the late 1960s, the Shallows had become a name spoken only in whispers. Decades of disappearances, rumors, and inexplicable happenings had turned it into a place of quiet dread, avoided even by the most skeptical. The county officially removed the area from public maps after repeated survey failures, citing unstable ground conditions, though many believed it was a thinly veiled attempt to bury its history. But even without documentation, its legend continued to grow, fueled by travelers who claimed to see strange figures wandering near the old Maddox estate at dusk, pale silhouettes that vanished when approached. It was during this time that a group of university researchers arrived, determined to uncover what they believed was an elaborate rural myth. Their leader, Dr. Henry Arliston, a cultural anthropologist from Pennsylvania, saw the Shallows as a perfect case study in small-town superstition. What he found instead would never leave him. Dr. Arliston and his small team spent a week exploring the overgrown remains of the settlement. They recorded the layout of the old cemetery, noting irregularities in spacing and density. They observed that several graves were unusually shallow, some less than 2 feet deep, and that the soil seemed to move slightly when touched, as if the ground was breathing. On their third night, they set up camp near the ruins of the Maddox mansion. In his field notes, Arliston described hearing what sounded like faint voices under the earth. At first, they dismissed it as wind, but as the hours passed, the voices became clearer, a chorus of low, rhythmic murmurs that seemed to grow louder the longer they listened. When dawn came, one of the assistants, a young woman named Claire Doran, refused to continue. She claimed she had seen people walking between the graves, dozens of them, yet none left footprints. That night, Arliston recorded his final entry, writing that the ground is alive with whispers, and every whisper sounds like a name. The following morning, their camp was found abandoned. Their equipment, journals, and vehicles were recovered days later, but the team was never seen again. Months after their disappearance, locals who went searching found something strange at the site. All of the graves they had disturbed were covered again, neatly, as though someone had taken care to restore order. The only evidence left behind was a single reel of film showing the team standing near the mansion at sunset. As the camera panned across the field, a shadow moved behind them, not of a person, but something larger, amorphous, stretching across the ground like a dark wave. From that point on, no researcher dared to revisit the shallows, and the legend evolved into something greater than fear. It became a warning that some histories are meant to stay buried. The 1970s brought a new kind of attention to the shallows, from those who sought not to study it, but to capture its phenomenon on tape, with terrifying results. In the 1970s, the shallows became the subject of a brief but unsettling resurgence in public fascination. Urban explorers, journalists, and paranormal enthusiasts, emboldened by the growing interest in American hauntings, began to venture toward the forgotten town. Most returned with nothing but eerie photographs of decaying structures and overgrown roads. But a few came back with stories that seemed too consistent to ignore. They spoke of a persistent hum that grew louder near the Maddox estate, of shadows that moved even when there was no light, and of the overwhelming sense that they were being watched from beneath the ground rather than above it. What had once been a quiet local legend was now whispered across state lines as one of the most cursed properties in the country. Among those drawn to the shallows was a journalist named Paul Redding, a writer for a small Massachusetts newspaper. His goal was to debunk the myth and expose what he believed to be generations of fabricated folklore. He interviewed aging residents from surrounding towns, all of whom recalled the Maddox family with a strange mix of fear and pity. One elderly man told him, they stopped burying people because the ground started giving them back. Redding dismissed it as small-town hysteria, but curiosity led him to spend a night near the ruins of the Maddox mansion. The next morning, his recorder was found outside the estate gates, still running. What it captured was enough to make even skeptics uneasy. For nearly 3 hours, the audio contained nothing but wind and the occasional creak of distant branches. Then, faintly, a soft melody emerged, a piano, playing the same slow waltz that had once echoed through the Maddox ballroom. Beneath it, a low chorus of voices began to whisper, their words indecipherable but rhythmic, as though chanting in unison. The sound grew louder, more layered, until it abruptly stopped with a single note and then silence. Redding was never found. His car remained parked by the roadside, keys in the ignition, his notes scattered across the passenger seat. The tape spread quietly among local radio enthusiasts before being confiscated by authorities, but not before a few copies circulated in underground circles. Those who listened claimed that even when the piano stopped, the recording wasn't truly silent. If played at high volume, one could hear the faint beating of a heart beneath the static. Whether it was a trick of sound or something more, no one could say for certain. But it reignited the terror surrounding the shallows, convincing many that the land was not just haunted, it was awake, aware, and listening to anyone who dared to disturb its long-buried secrets. The 1980s would see the last major attempt to document the shallows, an expedition by students that would provide the final, chilling piece of evidence before the area was sealed for good. By the 1980s, the shallows had been completely reclaimed by the earth. Nature swallowed the remains of the Maddox estate, trees splitting through brick walls, vines curling over the gravestones, and the once grand iron gate rusted shut. The county declared the area unsafe, prohibiting entry due to sinkhole activity, though locals knew better. The shallows wasn't collapsing, it was consuming. People from nearby towns reported hearing strange vibrations in the ground, like distant thunder with no storm. Others swore they saw dim lights moving beneath the soil on moonless nights, weaving through the terrain as if something below was alive and restless. Despite every warning, the legend still attracted thrill-seekers, and one in particular would reignite its darkest chapter. In 1984, a group of college students from Boston decided to document the shallows for a class project on forgotten American towns. Among them was a history major named Daniel Lowe, who was particularly fascinated by the Maddox family and their unreported burials. The group brought cameras, audio recorders, and flashlights, confident that they were chasing nothing more than a story. They camped near the old cemetery, filming interviews with locals during the day and exploring the grounds at night. The first night was uneventful, only the sound of wind and crickets. But on the second night, something shifted. Their footage captured faint, rhythmic knocks echoing through the soil, followed by a low hum that caused their microphones to distort. One of the students laughed it off, calling it seismic noise, but the next morning, their campsite was destroyed. Tents were shredded, footprints led in circles around their campfire, and the ground was soft, freshly turned in places where no one had dug. Daniel's notes from that day grew increasingly frantic, his handwriting jagged. He wrote that he could hear breathing from the ground and that the cemetery's soil felt warm, pulsing faintly under his boots. By the third night, their film abruptly ended mid-recording. The camera, recovered weeks later by search teams, showed only static for the final 10 minutes, except for one flickering image, a human silhouette standing perfectly still in the distance, its shadow stretching impossibly long across the graves. The students were never found. The investigation concluded that they'd gotten lost in unstable terrain, but the locals knew that explanation was hollow. The shallows had taken them, just as it had taken everyone who lingered too long. After that incident, all access to the area was permanently closed, and warning signs were erected along the highway. But every now and then, travelers claimed to hear voices in the trees, calling their names softly, urging them to follow the old road to where the earth still breathes and waits. In the 1990s, a professional documentary crew secured rare permission to film inside the restricted zone, capturing what would become the last known footage from within the shallows. In the early 1990s, the legend of the shallows faded into the background of forgotten American folklore, yet those who lived near its borders never truly forgot. The county kept the area fenced off, labeling it a restricted environmental hazard, though no one could explain exactly what contamination was being contained. Despite the official silence, people still reported strange occurrences on the outskirts: electrical interference, compasses spinning wildly, and an unshakable feeling of being watched when passing by the old road. Truck drivers who took the back route claimed their radios picked up faint music that vanished when they left the area, a slow, ghostly waltz carried on static. The shallows, it seemed, still had a pulse, waiting patiently for those curious enough to return. That curiosity came in the form of a man named Richard Calloway, a documentarian known for his series on lost towns and unsolved mysteries. Unlike the reckless explorers before him, Calloway approached the project with professionalism. He requested permission from the county to film within the restricted area and surprisingly received it, under the condition that his team stay within certain mapped zones. It was the first time in over a decade anyone had been allowed inside the boundaries of the shallows. The team consisted of 5 members, 2 historians, a sound engineer, a camera operator, and Calloway himself. They began filming in the late fall of 1992, capturing sweeping shots of overgrown roads, crumbling walls, and the faint outline of what had once been the Maddox mansion. For the first 2 days, everything went smoothly. But on the third day, the crew began noticing subtle irregularities in their footage. Background sounds appeared on recordings that hadn't been audible during filming: low voices, indistinct whispers, and a faint piano melody threading through the wind. At first, They assumed it was interference from their audio equipment, but then the sound engineer reported something far stranger. The voices weren't random, they formed patterns, repeating specific words that seemed to resemble names. Late that evening, the power to their equipment failed completely, even though their batteries were fully charged. When they returned to their base camp to review what little footage they had left, one clip stood out. The camera had caught movement near the ruins of the ballroom. A flicker of light, then a shape resembling a person standing near the shattered windows, their outline faintly glowing against the darkness. Calloway insisted on returning to investigate the next morning, but by sunrise, 2 members of his crew were gone. Their tents were untouched, their gear still in place. Only the sound engineer's recorder remained, and when played, it captured a single phrase whispered again and again, "They don't rest." Calloway's remaining footage was confiscated after the investigation, and he never spoke publicly about the Shallows again, telling friends only that some histories consume those who try to tell them. The story of the Shallows seemed to reach its conclusion as the 20th century ended, but the property had one last, terrifying chapter to reveal when a new owner attempted to reclaim the land. In the weeks following the unsettling discovery of the hidden journal, the air around the Maddox estate began to thicken with something that couldn't be explained by mere superstition. Lights flickered even when the power was steady, and doors that had been locked the night before were found wide open by morning. The once silent hallways now seemed to carry faint whispers, like the house itself was trying to communicate. The new owner, who had moved in full of excitement and curiosity, now found themselves trapped between disbelief and dread. What had started as minor disturbances, missing keys, cold drafts, and the eerie sensation of being watched slowly escalated into something far more tangible. At first, they thought it was stress or imagination, but the patterns grew too deliberate to dismiss. The whispers always came from the east wing, near the oldest part of the house, the section built by the original Maddox patriarch in the late 1800s. One night, while reviewing the notes found within the old journal, the owner noticed something strange, a repeated reference to the Burden Room. No floor plan showed such a place, but the tone of the entries shifted each time it was mentioned, as if even writing about it brought unease to whoever had kept that record. Driven by a mix of fear and fascination, they began searching for it, tracing the old blueprints, tapping on walls, following cracks and seams that didn't align. Eventually, behind a bookcase warped with age, they found a door sealed shut with rusted nails and something darker that looked almost ceremonial. Breaking through that barrier released a gust of air so cold and foul it felt like it came from another time entirely. Inside, the room was small, lined with wooden crates, each marked with initials of Maddox family members long deceased. The floorboards were stained, the air dense with decay, and in the center sat an iron chair chained to the ground. It was there that the truth began to surface, not in words but in the oppressive silence that seemed to settle over everything. The journal's final entries hinted that the Maddox family had used the room for something unspeakable, a form of punishment or ritual meant to preserve their lineage. The new owner's dreams grew darker after that discovery, filled with flashes of figures standing in corners, whispers calling their name, and the constant sound of something dragging across the wooden floors. They tried leaving for a few days, but wherever they went, the unease followed, a scent of old smoke, a whisper in reflections, a coldness that clung to their skin. It became clear that the house wasn't just haunted, it was sentient, bound to the weight of generations who refused to let go. The deeper they searched for answers, the more it felt as if the Maddox heirs were no longer just memories they were watching. As the new owner's sanity began to fray, they uncovered the terrible truth that bound the Maddox family to the land, a truth that was now binding them as well. After uncovering the existence of the Burden Room, the new owner's nights turned into an unending blur of sleepless fear. Each creak of the floorboards felt intentional, every gust of wind seemed to whisper something they couldn't quite understand. The Maddox house, once merely old and eerie, had now become a living presence that fed off awareness. The more the owner tried to ignore the disturbances, the more aggressive they became. Shadows began to shift independently of any light source, moving slowly across walls as if pacing. Mirrors fogged from within, revealing faint outlines of faces that vanished the moment one blinked. Even the walls seemed to sigh late at night, releasing faint moans that carried through the vents like voices calling from below. What terrified the owner most was how the house appeared to know them, learning their habits, predicting their movements, and responding to their fear. One evening, desperate for clarity, the owner revisited the town library to dig deeper into the Maddox lineage. There they discovered a series of old newspaper clippings dating back to the early 1900s. Each headline carried a similar tone: Maddox heir found dead under mysterious circumstances, estate worker vanishes without a trace, Judge Maddox declared mentally unfit. The family's history was riddled with disappearances, inheritance disputes, and accusations of occult practices, though each was quietly dismissed or settled out of court. One name, however, appeared repeatedly: Josephine Maddox, the youngest daughter who, according to records, was institutionalized after claiming she could hear the dead crying beneath the floor. In her personal letters, preserved by a local historian, she wrote about a dark inheritance, describing how every heir was chosen not by bloodline but by something far older that resided within the house itself. When the owner returned that night, the house seemed to be waiting. The temperature had dropped unnaturally low, and the faint smell of iron filled the halls. From the east wing came the soft sound of music, an old phonograph playing a lullaby that hadn't been used in decades. Following it led them back to the burden room, where the chair in the center was no longer empty. Instead, there rested a bundle of yellowed cloth, shaped like a small figure. Trembling, the owner reached closer, and as they did, a whisper echoed from behind: "You opened the door, now you belong here." The air turned heavy, pressing against their chest, and the walls seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. In that suffocating moment, they realized the Maddox curse wasn't just a story, it was a binding pact. The house had claimed every heir who uncovered its truth, and by unearthing its secrets, they had unknowingly become the next. The final descent into madness was swift and terrifying, as the house began to physically transform, revealing its ultimate purpose. The days following that night blurred into an almost fevered delirium for the owner. Sleep came in fragments, torn apart by the sound of footsteps pacing just outside their locked bedroom door. The once familiar hallways of the Maddox house now felt like a labyrinth that rearranged itself after sunset. Doors that led to the kitchen by day opened into empty corridors by night, and the faint murmur of voices followed wherever they went, speaking in tones that were almost human, but not quite. The owner tried to document what was happening, setting up cameras in the main hall and the burden room, but each morning, the footage showed nothing except static and faint flickers of light moving across the screen. Even more disturbing was that the cameras often captured their own reflection in places they hadn't been. It was as if the house was mocking their attempt to prove its hauntings, showing them how futile resistance truly was. Neighbors began to notice strange things, too. They spoke of the windows glowing faintly at night, silhouettes standing motionless on the second floor, and the sound of someone crying drifting out over the fields. The mailman refused to approach the gate after claiming he saw someone staring at him from a window that had been nailed shut for years. The town's older residents whispered that the house had woken up again, just like it had every time a new Maddox heir tried to live there. When the owner reached out for help, their calls were met with silence or static. Phones died inexplicably, lights flickered, and power lines around the estate were found frayed or cut, as though something didn't want communication to leave the property. It became clear that isolation wasn't an accident, it was part of the curse. The owner's sanity began to erode under the constant dread. They started speaking aloud to fill the silence, only to hear their own voice respond seconds later, echoing with a subtle difference in tone. They found muddy footprints leading from the garden to the attic, though the trapdoor was still locked from the outside. One morning, they discovered fresh dirt scattered across the dining room floor, an exact trail leading from the front door to the burden room. The bundle that had once rested in the chair was gone. Instead, there was an open grave-shaped indentation in the wooden floorboards. The realization struck with bone-deep certainty. The house was reenacting something, repeating an ancient ritual that had claimed every Maddox before them. And now, it was almost complete. The air grew colder each night, as if the house was preparing for one final act, the moment it would claim another soul for the Shallows, and seal their name among the dead who were never reported but always buried. In the end, the house completed its grim ritual, and the Shallows claimed its final victim of the modern era, leaving behind only questions and a lingering sense of dread. By the time autumn arrived, the owner had become little more than a shadow of the person who'd first purchased the Maddox property. Their journal, once filled with notes and rational explanations, had turned into frantic scribbles, pages torn, ink smeared, handwriting unrecognizable. Neighbors who still dared to pass by swore they saw lights flickering at strange hours, as though the house itself was breathing. On several nights, faint music could be heard drifting from the ballroom, soft and melancholic, the melody of an old waltz no one could identify. The owner insisted they'd never played music, but their records showed the phonograph turning on by itself, even when unplugged. It became clear that the house was no longer just haunted, it was performing, reenacting memories of the past in real time. One evening, desperate to put an end to the torment, the owner decided to confront the heart of the estate, the cellar beneath the ballroom, which had been sealed since the early 1900s. According to town archives, it was once used for wine storage but had been boarded shut after the last Maddox funeral. Breaking through the rotted planks, the owner descended into the cold, damp air below. The scent of earth and decay was overwhelming. The walls were lined with names carved by hand, some matching those on local gravestones, others unknown. In the center stood a stone slab covered in soil, surrounded by melted candles long since extinguished. Beneath the dust lay several tarnished rings and lockets, all engraved with initials belonging to the Maddox family line. It wasn't a cellar, it was a burial vault. As the owner brushed away the dirt from one of the rings, they noticed something strange, fresh soil beneath it, darker and wet. Before they could move, a sound emerged, a low, rhythmic knocking that came from beneath the slab. Each knock echoed through the chamber like a heartbeat, steady and deliberate. Then came the faint murmur of voices, layered and overlapping, as if the earth itself was whispering. They fled upstairs, but the noise followed through the walls, the floors, even the air itself. Every mirror reflected not their own face but the image of someone else, pale and hollow-eyed, mouthing silent words. The owner tried to leave that night, but the house wouldn't let them. Every door led back to the main hall. Every window showed the same view, the Maddox graveyard, with one freshly dug plot waiting at the edge. The name carved into its headstone was their own. From that moment, the owner stopped writing. Their journal ends abruptly, the last page marked only by a shaky line. They don't report deaths here because the house never lets anyone truly die. The final disappearance was as complete as all the others, leaving no trace behind but the enduring legend of a town that refuses to be forgotten. Weeks later, the Maddox estate once again stood silent. The windows were dark, the front gates locked, and the surrounding air hung heavy with the stillness that comes after a storm. Locals who passed by claimed the property seemed different now, emptier, colder, as if whatever presence had once occupied it had finally consumed what it wanted. The new owner was gone, vanishing without any formal notice or sale. Mail piled up on the porch, the grass grew knee-high, and by winter, snow had sealed the grounds in an untouched white shroud. Yet, those who dared to linger too long near the property swore they could see footprints leading from the gate to the front door, though no one had entered for months. The sheriff's department investigated the disappearance but found no signs of struggle, no trace of forced entry, and no fingerprints that matched anyone in the missing persons database. The only thing left behind was the owner's camera, still recording when it was discovered on the second floor, facing a mirror in the hallway. When the footage was examined, it revealed little more than flickering shadows and static interference. However, at precisely 3:17 a.m., the camera captured a brief reflection, someone standing in the frame behind the operator, though the room itself was empty. The figure appeared translucent, dressed in old-fashioned morning attire, its face indistinct but unmistakably human. Just before the recording cut out, the reflection smiled. After that, the camera fell to the floor, and the video ended in silence. Experts called it a glitch, an anomaly of light and lens distortion. But those familiar with the history of the Shallows knew better. It was the same mirror said to have once reflected every Maddox Air moments before their unexplained disappearance. After the investigation concluded, the Shallows was officially listed as abandoned property. No buyers came forward, even at a fraction of its appraised value. The townspeople avoided it altogether, refusing to even utter its name. Strangely, letters continued to arrive addressed to the last owner, each postmarked from unknown locations, the handwriting faintly similar to theirs. Inside every envelope was a single sentence written on aged paper: "The soil remembers." Over time, the Maddox mansion became more myth than memory, a cautionary story passed around campfires and whispered in classrooms. Yet, those who venture close enough on moonless nights claim the ballroom lights still flicker, and faint music still plays, a haunting waltz that fades the moment anyone steps through the gates, as if the house is aware it's being watched and pauses, waiting for its next audience to arrive. In the years that followed, the Shallows continued to exert its pull on the curious, proving that some places never truly release their hold on the living. Years passed, and the Shallows slipped quietly into the folds of American folklore. It became one of those places people mentioned in the same breath as the Winchester House or the Bell Witch Cave, an enigma that couldn't be erased no matter how deeply time tried to bury it. The estate was fenced off by local authorities, but that did little to deter those drawn to the morbid allure of its legend. Paranormal investigators, thrill seekers, and even university researchers from Boston made the trip to study the land and its lingering phenomena. What they found was always the same: malfunctioning equipment, drained batteries, and audio filled with distorted whispers. No one ever managed to capture anything conclusive, yet all left with an undeniable sense of dread. It wasn't just fear, it was as though something had pressed itself into their memories, a residue of presence that followed them long after they returned home. In the late 1990s, a small team of documentarians attempted to film inside the house for a project on forgotten American hauntings. Their footage, though never officially released, was rumored to have circulated privately among horror enthusiasts. In it, the group can be seen entering the property at dusk, laughing nervously as they set up their equipment. The first hour is uneventful, but by nightfall, strange occurrences begin. One cameraman captures faint movement on the staircase, something crawling rather than walking, but vanishing before focus can be adjusted. Later, the boom operator claims to hear voices under the floorboards, whispering in a pattern that almost sounds like breathing. At one point, all 5 lights in the ballroom flicker in unison, then go out entirely. When power returns seconds later, one crew member is gone. His microphone continues transmitting for 6 minutes, recording nothing but the sound of shoveling dirt. Authorities dismissed the claims as staged, a ploy for publicity, but what unsettled everyone was what came afterward. The documentary's lead producer, a woman named Clara Niles, reportedly refused to discuss the project ever again. She moved to the Midwest and was later found with pages of handwritten notes referencing the Maddox family's agreement with the earth. No one understood what it meant, but the phrasing matched lines found in the original Maddox records from 1893. The idea that the house had a will of its own became the central theme of every retelling that followed. Whether or not the spirits of the shallows were real, one truth endured across every account, that the soil beneath the estate seemed to keep its own record, a living archive of every soul that had ever touched it. And no one who disturbed it ever left unchanged. As we bring this dark chapter to a close, the legacy of the shallows endures, a permanent stain on the map and on the human psyche. By the early 2000s, the shallows had transformed from a local legend into a forbidden landmark of American darkness. Urban explorers documented its rotting architecture, uploading grainy videos and photos that quickly went viral, reigniting interest in the mystery of the Maddox family. What struck viewers most was not what could be seen, but what lingered just beyond visibility, shapes in the corner of frames, reflections in broken glass, faces forming in peeling wallpaper. Many dismissed it as digital artifacting, tricks of low light and imagination. But those who had been to the site insisted there was something different about the shallows, something that didn't behave like a normal haunting. The house didn't simply echo the past, it seemed to record and replay it, bending the memories of those who entered until they became part of its story. Those who stayed too long reported losing time, waking up outside the gates with no recollection of how they got there, their watches frozen at 3:17 a.m., the exact time the last known footage had ended years earlier. Eventually, the property was declared unsafe for trespassing. Fences were erected, and patrols were ordered to keep wanderers away, but the law never stood much chance against curiosity. Even after the house was officially condemned, new reports emerged. Drivers passing along the nearby road claimed to see faint candlelight glowing from the windows, though no electricity had run through the estate in decades. Some nights, witnesses described hearing the soft rhythm of a waltz carried by the wind, always ending abruptly, followed by a single low thud that sounded eerily like a coffin lid closing. In 2012, a real estate developer from Connecticut tried to purchase the land with plans to turn it into a luxury retreat. But the sale never went through. According to leaked county documents, the soil test returned anomalous biological readings that could not be explained. When investigators attempted to collect samples, the ground was described as warm to the touch, even during winter frost. 2 months later, the developer withdrew the bid without explanation and left the state entirely. Those who reviewed the findings noted something disturbing in the report margins, a handwritten note in red ink: "The land rejects the living." Since then, the shallows has remained untouched, reclaimed by the forest around it. The Maddox estate now stands like a fossil of something that once pretended to be human, its walls still holding on to the echo of footsteps, the whisper of names long forgotten, and the faint pulse of a secret buried too deep to die. Even today, travelers who dare to wander near the ruins say that if you press your ear to the ground, you can hear it, the soft hum of a heart still beating somewhere beneath the soil. As the shadows of this unsolved mystery fade into the past, the secrets of history await you. Subscribe now to Secrets of History, and join us as we unearth more chilling tales from the abyss of time. Hit that bell icon, and let the past whisper its truths to you next time.